In the autumn of 1979, a Belgian paratrooper stood in a hangar at Schaffen Air Base, 20 kilometers north of Leuven, holding a rifle that didn't exist in any military's inventory 6 months earlier. The equipment was black, compact, with a folding stock that reduced its profile to something you could slip into a gear bag without rearranging everything else inside. It weighed just over 3 kilograms unloaded, light enough that you noticed the difference after carrying it for 8 hours, yet sturdy enough that it didn't feel like a toy. The designation stamped on the receiver read FNC, and without knowing the history, one might have thought it was just another 5.56mm model joining the dozens of designs that had emerged since NATO standardized around the smaller cartridge in the early 1970s. But the FNC wasn't just another piece of hardware. It was Belgium's answer to a question the country hadn't wanted to face. What do you do when the tool that made you famous becomes obsolete? For 3 decades, FN Herstal had produced the FAL, the Fusil Automatique Léger, a 7.62 51mm rifle that had equipped more than 90 countries and earned the nickname the right arm of the free world. The FAL had been Belgium's engineering crown jewel, a design so reliable and so widely adopted that it had made FN Herstal synonymous with military equipment. But by 1975, the landscape had shifted. NATO was transitioning to 5.56mm, driven by technical evaluations and the recognition that modern infantry activity favored lighter loads and higher rates of controllable operation. The FAL, brilliant as it was, belonged to a different era. The FNC arrived without fanfare. There were no grand announcements or press tours showcasing Belgium's latest innovation. Instead, the equipment entered service quietly, issued first to airborne units and special forces, personnel who needed something more compact than the FAL, but just as dependable. If you asked the engineers at FN Herstal what made the FNC different, they wouldn't point to revolutionary technology or groundbreaking ballistics. They'd point to the gas system, the way the rifle managed recoil, and the folding stock that allowed for easy storage without disassembly. These weren't dramatic features, but they were the result of careful thought about what operators actually needed, rather than what looked impressive in a catalogue. The paratrooper at Schaffen didn't care about any of that. He cared that the equipment fit in his gear, that it didn't jam during training exercises, and that when he exited a C-130 at low altitude, he could deploy the stock with one hand and have a functioning tool within seconds of hitting the ground. The FNC did all of those things without complaint, and in the world of industrial engineering, reliability is the only form of genius that matters. If stories like this help you see how engineering quietly shaped history, tell us in the comments what surprised you so far, and stay with us for the next chapter. FN Herstal in 1975 was a company standing at a crossroads it hadn't chosen. Located in the industrial city of Herstal, just outside Liège, the firm had spent the post-war decades building the FAL, a design so successful that it had made Belgium a major player in the global equipment trade, despite being a country smaller than Maryland. The FAL had been more than a product. It was proof that a small nation with a strong engineering tradition could compete with superpowers. But success had made FN cautious. When NATO began discussing a shift to 5.56mm ammunition in the early 1970s, FN's initial response was to defend the 7.62mm standard, arguing that the larger cartridge offered superior ballistics and performance. The problem was that NATO wasn't asking for opinions. The decision had already been made, driven by international experiences and the recognition that personnel could carry twice as much 5.50mm ammunition for the same weight as 7.62mm. Other European manufacturers had seen the shift coming and had already begun developing new designs. Heckler & Koch had the G41, SIG had the SG540, and Beretta was working on the AR-70. FN was late to the race, and everyone knew it. Internally, the company faced a decision: try to adapt the FAL to 5.56mm or start from scratch with a completely new design. The engineers chose the latter, but it wasn't an easy choice. Starting fresh meant abandoning decades of manufacturing expertise, retooling production lines, and accepting that the FAL's dominance was over. It also meant designing a tool that could compete against manufacturers who'd had a head start. The FNC project began in 1976 under tight constraints. The equipment needed to be lightweight, which meant carefully managing material choices and eliminating unnecessary mass. It needed to be reliable in harsh conditions, which ruled out systems that depended on tight tolerances or complex maintenance. And it needed to be affordable, because Belgium's defense budget was limited and export customers were price-sensitive. The design team focused on proven principles rather than innovation for its own sake. They selected a short-stroke gas piston system, similar to what had been used in other reliable international designs and in FN's own earlier projects. They built the lower receiver from stamped steel rather than machined aluminum, reducing cost while maintaining durability. They designed the internal groups to be simple enough that an operator could field strip the equipment without tools. Every decision was pragmatic, driven by the understanding that personnel don't need perfection. They need something that works when environmental conditions are at their worst. By 1977, the first prototypes were ready for testing, and FN submitted the design to Belgium's evaluation board, knowing that approval at home was essential before approaching export markets. The equipment that emerged from those trials was leaner than the FAL, more compact than the G3, and mechanically simpler than the M16. It didn't revolutionize anything, but it didn't need to. The heart of the FNC's operation lies in its gas system, a mechanism that seems simple until you understand the alternatives it rejected. When the equipment is operated, the propellant inside the cartridge burns and generates high-pressure gas that moves the projectile down the barrel. But that gas doesn't simply dissipate after the projectile exits. In automatic and semi-automatic designs, some of that energy is captured and used to cycle the action, extracting the spent casing, loading a fresh round, and preparing the equipment to operate again. The question that separates designs isn't whether to use gas operation, but how to manage it. The M16, designed by Eugene Stoner in the 1950s, uses direct impingement. In this system, propellant gas is channeled through a tube that runs from a port in the barrel back to the bolt carrier. The gas enters the carrier and pushes directly against the internal components, driving them rearward and cycling the action. It's mechanically elegant because it eliminates moving parts between the gas port and the bolt, but it has a weakness. The gas carries combustion residue directly into the assembly, where it can accumulate and cause friction issues if the equipment isn't regularly cleaned. In humid or dusty environments, this can become a problem. The FNC uses a different approach, a short-stroke gas piston. In this system, propellant gas pushes a small piston that sits above the barrel, just forward of the receiver. The piston travels rearward for approximately 10 millimeters before a return spring stops it and drives it back to its starting position. During that brief rearward movement, the piston strikes the carrier, imparting enough momentum to unlock the rotating bolt and start the cycle. The key difference is that the piston never travels all the way into the receiver, and the gas is vented outside the equipment rather than inside the internal assembly. This keeps the internals cleaner and reduces the sensitivity to ammunition variations. The rotating bolt itself consists of 7 lugs that engage corresponding recesses in the barrel extension. When the equipment is in battery, ready for use, the bolt is locked in place, and the lugs distribute the pressure evenly. When the piston strikes the carrier moves rearward and rotates the bolt approximately 30 degrees, disengaging the lugs and allowing the bolt to withdraw. A cam pin guides this rotation, ensuring the bolt unlocks at the correct moment and relocks properly when the action closes on the next round. The entire cycle happens in milliseconds, fast enough for sustained use, but controlled enough that the equipment remains accurate in precision mode. Engineers at FN chose this system because it balanced complexity and reliability. A short-stroke piston requires more parts than direct impingement, but fewer than long-stroke systems used in other famous models. It keeps the moving mass low, which improves handling characteristics, while isolating the internals from the harshest effects of combustion. In testing, the FNC demonstrated a mean frequency between failures exceeding 10,000 cycles, a figure that placed it among the most reliable 5.56-meter designs of its generation. Do you think this design choice was inevitable or a risky gamble at the time? Share your view in the comments and pass this story to someone who enjoys understanding how things really work. The first trials of the FNC took place in 1978 at Belgium's testing grounds near Brachat, a forested area north of Antwerp, where temperatures could drop below freezing in winter and climb into the high 20s Celsius in summer. The Belgian military had structured the evaluation around endurance testing rather than just precision shooting, a decision that reflected the country's practical approach to equipment. They weren't looking for something that could only punch tight groups at 300 meters. They were looking for a tool that would function reliably after being dropped in mud, soaked in rain, and operated continuously until the barrel reached high temperatures. FN's engineers knew the stakes. Belgium's procurement budget was limited, and convincing the authorities to replace the FAL required demonstrating not just competence, but superiority under conditions where other designs had failed. The testing protocol included submersion tests, where the equipment was placed in water mixed with sand and then operated without cleaning. It included cold soak tests, where the tools were stored at -20 degrees Celsius for 72 hours and then expected to function immediately. It included heat endurance tests, where the equipment was operated in rapid succession until the barrel glowed and the handguards began to smoke. The FNC passed these tests, but not without revisions. Early prototypes showed a tendency for the gas piston to stick after prolonged exposure to sub-zero temperatures, a problem traced to inadequate clearances in the gas cylinder. Engineers widened the tolerances slightly, sacrificing a negligible amount of efficiency for reliable function in cold weather. Another issue emerged during high-volume operation. The chamber would occasionally fail to extract casings after more than 300 cycles in rapid succession. Investigation revealed that the chamber wasn't fluted. It lacked the longitudinal grooves that help break the seal between the casing and chamber walls. Adding flutes solved the problem at the cost of slightly increased manufacturing complexity. What impressed the evaluation board wasn't that the FNC performed flawlessly from day one. It was that FN responded to problems quickly and systematically. When a component showed signs of wear during endurance testing, engineers didn't simply replace it with a stronger material. They analyzed the stress patterns, discovered that the issue initiated at a sharp corner in the geometry, and redesigned the part with a radius that distributed stress more evenly. When testers noted that the sites were difficult to use in low light, FN added luminous inserts without waiting for a formal request. These weren't dramatic innovations, but they demonstrated engineering discipline. By late 1978, the FNC had completed military trials and was formally adopted by Belgium's armed forces. The decision wasn't unanimous. Some officials argued that the FAL remained adequate and that transitioning was an unnecessary expense, but the motion carried. FN immediately shifted to production planning, knowing that the Belgian order alone wouldn't sustain the program. The design needed export customers, and that meant competing against models already established in international markets. The folding stock on the FNC seems, at first glance, like a convenience feature, something you'd appreciate but not consider essential. Most infantry equipment is operated from the shoulder with the stock extended, and in that configuration, whether the stock folds or not doesn't matter much. But in 1979, Belgium wasn't just buying a tool for conventional units. The first personnel to receive the FNC were paratroopers, individuals who would carry the equipment during airborne insertions and needed to stow it securely during descent. For them, the folding stock wasn't a convenience, it was a requirement. The stock itself is a steel frame that folds to the left side, reducing the overall length from 997 millimeters to 766 millimeters when collapsed. That 30-centimeter reduction might not sound significant until you try to pack the equipment into a deployment harness or a vehicle mount and realize that every centimeter matters. The hinge mechanism is reinforced with steel inserts to prevent wobble when extended, a detail that adds weight but ensures the equipment remains accurate even after thousands of cycles. When locked in the open position, the stock is as rigid as a fixed design with no play or movement that would affect performance. But the deeper reason the folding stock matters has nothing to do with airborne operations. It reveals how FN understood the direction of modern conflict. In 1950, when the FAL was designed, infantry activity was still imagined as something that happened in open terrain at ranges exceeding 300 meters. By 1979, that vision had been replaced by something faster and more chaotic. Helicopter insertions, urban operations, and rapid response to developing situations. Personnel no longer marched to the site. They flew there, and when they arrived, they needed to be effective within seconds. The FNC's folding stock was Belgium's acknowledgement of this change. It was a recognition that future needs might not look like the past, that mobility might matter more than raw firepower, and that the equipment of the future would be defined not just by how far it could shoot, but by how quickly it could be deployed. Other designs had folding stocks. The AK series had offered one since the 1950s. But the FNC's stock was designed with a level of care that suggested FN was thinking beyond the immediate sale. The stock didn't just fold. It locked securely in both positions, it didn't rattle, and it could be deployed with one hand while the other held onto a harness or a vehicle grab bar. This attention to operational detail is what separated the FNC from equipment designed to look impressive in photos but fell short in actual use. FN hadn't set out to build the world's most innovative tool. They'd set out to build something that Belgian paratroopers would trust when they jumped from a C-130 at 500 feet. And that constraint shaped every decision from the gas system to the sight radius. The FNC never achieved the global dominance that Herstal had enjoyed with the FAL. Belgium adopted it, as did Indonesia and Sweden, but the equipment remained a specialist's tool, respected by those who used it, but overshadowed by designs with larger production runs and more aggressive marketing. Heckler & Koch captured more European contracts with later models. The M16 platform continued to dominate Western military procurement. The FNC found its niche with airborne units and special forces, personnel who valued the compact design and mechanical simplicity, but it never became a standard-issue tool for large conscript forces. Yet the FNC's legacy isn't measured in sales figures. It's measured in what it represented for Belgium and for Herstal. The equipment proved that a small country could adapt to changing circumstances without abandoning its engineering identity. It showed that you didn't need revolutionary technology to build something valuable. You needed careful attention to what users actually needed and the discipline to deliver it consistently. The FNC wasn't famous, but it worked. And in the world of industrial engineering, that's the highest compliment possible. The design's influence appeared in unexpected places. When FN designed the P-90 in the late 1980s, Engineers drew on lessons learned from the FNC's gas system, applying the same principle of isolating propellant gases from the internal assembly. When Fabrique Nationale developed the SCAR series in the 2000s, the modularity and simplicity that characterized the FNC's design philosophy was still visible in the newer architecture. The FNC hadn't revolutionized design, but it had refined it, and that refinement became part of FN's institutional knowledge. For Belgium, the FNC was a quiet acknowledgement of a larger truth. History doesn't wait for anyone. The country that had built the FAL and equipped half the world's forces couldn't rest on past success. The world had moved to 5.56 millimeters, and Belgium had to move with it or become irrelevant. The FNC was that transition made tangible, a tool that honored FN's engineering heritage while accepting that the future demanded different answers. Today, the FNC remains in limited service with Belgian specialized units, maintained more for its reliability than for any technological advantage. Newer designs have surpassed it in modularity and ergonomics, but the personnel who carried the FNC remember it fondly, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was dependable. In the end, that's what engineering is. Not the pursuit of perfection, but the delivery of reliability when it matters most. The FNC did that quietly, without fanfare, and that's why it deserves to be remembered. If you enjoy calm, true stories about how engineering shaped the world, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us from which country you're watching.